In this video, we're going to look at the libertarian to alt-right pipeline. Now, we're not going to do it in the lame way that most journalists do, other people. To them, it's a boogeyman story of evil. They don't really want to understand it. They want to demonize it. Don't go over there, because there be dragons. But the reality is simple. Many people who were passionate libertarian years ago, they voted for Ron Paul, they shouted, "End the Fed." They're now finding themselves more and more in the dissonant right wing as time goes on. How did this happen? Let's start at the beginning of the pipe. What is a libertarian? What did they want? Well, they wanted a lot of things. Maybe they wanted sound money, where inflation didn't steal people's savings away. They would look at a man like Ludwig von Mises for insight. Mises said, quote, "Credit expansion and inflationary increase of the quantity of money frustrate the common man's attempt to save and accumulate reserves for less propitious days." In other words, normal people will sock some money away for when times get hard. But if the financial system steals value from savings, it harms those normal people in what they're trying to do. What else did libertarians care about? Well, they may have subscribed to notions of the business cycle, like in the Austrian School of Economics, how the government can create destructive boom and bust cycles in an economy. And more generally, if you look at libertarians, maybe they're the kind of people who believe that unless the government has a good reason to tell people what to do, then they shouldn't tell people what to do. If there's some sort of minor problem, often just letting people freely interact can solve it, or at least get some sort of adequate solution. Getting the government to step in on every little thing isn't really all that reasonable to a lot of these libertarians, and it often has unintended consequences. The broken window fallacy is understood well by many libertarians. And a lot of libertarians would hear someone like Thomas Sowell say something like, "There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs." And they would think, wow, that's true, but also it's very different. Most people are here to try and sell you their sort of government program that's going to fix everything. To hear something like that, that's much more reasonable. So that's where they started out. But what would happen when they entered this pipe, the libertarian to alt-right pipe? Well, really, the pipe is just them encountering certain ideas. And here, I'm going to get into a big one here, right? The US, more or less, is very libertarian. Free speech, gun rights, freedoms, a lot of these things. Maybe we're not perfect, but the libertarian spirit is fairly strong here compared to most places. If you were to list every country in the world and order them by most libertarian to most authoritarian, the vast majority of all countries would be a lot more authoritarian than the United States. So a lot of libertarians know about the founding of the United States and the principles of the founding fathers and have a lot of admiration for those men. And they would know that the founding fathers put into place immigration policies that preferred white Europeans, often Northwestern Europeans, and that lasted all the way until the 1960s, the 1965 Immigration Act. Basically, it's a white country founded by white people. Now, let's take a look at this article by the University of North Carolina. They used U.S. Department of Homeland Security data to see where we are getting immigrants from over time. We started out, of course, explicitly white European, but for the last few decades, less than 100 years, things have really changed. We're mostly bringing in people from different parts of the world. Latin America is a huge source of a lot of our immigrants now. Libertarian groups like to get speakers who fled Latin America to talk about the horrors of authoritarianism, talk about the horrors of socialism.
I emigrated from Venezuela, one of the most dangerous countries in the world today.
A lot of these countries where we're now getting our immigrants, a lot of these countries in Latin America and some of these other places, there's really no shortage of authoritarianism. They don't have the same freedoms that we have here. And while you can get some ex-Latin American to speak, and that might be good for spreading a message to the public, our libertarian going down the pipeline doesn't just see the anecdotes anymore. They're starting to see statistics about how immigrants from these more authoritarian places of the world, like Latin America, have affected our country. Let's take a look at free speech and hate speech laws. YouGov asked in 2015, quote, would you support or oppose a law that would make it a crime for people to make public comments intended to stir up hatred against a group based on such things as their race, gender, religion, ethnic origin, or sexual orientation? Now, libertarians will look at this sort of question very differently than most people. A lot of people will say, oh, well, if X is bad, or X is mean, or X is unpleasant, well, maybe we should have a law against X. Libertarians will look at this sort of question and they'll think at least one step out. They'll think, gosh, a question like this is really asking, should an existing government structure or a new government structure get the power to police and prosecute private citizens based off of this sort of thing? You might end up with a government organization that prosecutes people because that organization believes it can make a convincing court case that the speaker intended to stir up hatred. Do you really want a government organization actively working to silence private citizens in this way? After all, let's think about the UK. Someone in the UK might point out the grooming gangs of Middle Easterners abusing young British girls. That claim ultimately is either true or false. It's a truth-apt claim, but maybe it could be prosecuted. Maybe the government agency could say, even though what they said is true, it was intended to stir up hatred, so they should be locked up. So you could get potentially locked up for speaking the truth with this sort of law. That's scary. That's a libertarian nightmare of a government gone amok. Now, when you look at the results of this poll, white Americans are more opposed to the law than they support it. Hispanics, well, most of them arrived here within the last few decades, and they are more supportive of it than opposed to it, even though on some level they might be fleeing this sort of thing from the countries they came from. They still support it when they get here. Here's a Pew poll. General population in the United States, the plurality of people say, hey, smaller government's better. The Hispanic population, the supermajority says bigger government, kind of like their home countries. And we can look at it by generation. First generation, second generation, third generation or higher. I mean, some of these people have great-grandparents who were born here, so they've been living here for a long time, and they still majority support bigger government. Gun rights. Foreign-born Hispanics nearly universally oppose gun rights, just like back in their home countries. Even U.S.-born Hispanics, they were born here, still oppose gun rights. Whites are the only group that majority supports gun rights over gun control. Now, this is where we need to talk about averages. Averages have an effect on society. This is where people will get hung up emotionally. But a lot of our libertarians are able to push through the emotions and look at it for what it is. If you have a fairly live and let live libertarian neighborhood or town or state, you can have a fairly libertarian way of life. Even if there's some authoritarians mixed in there who think that there should be all sorts of rules about how you can paint your garage, they don't get to tell everyone else how to live if they can't get the political support, right? But if you get enough authoritarians to move in, you might see some of those rules start to get put in place. And now you can't choose what color your own drapes are. On some level, society's kind of like oil or fat. Do you know why butter is solid at room temperature and olive oil is liquid? Someone will say to you, oh, well, butter is saturated, olive oil is unsaturated, monounsaturated. Well, that's kind of true. Here's an article from canolainfo.org. As we can see, all of these different fats are just a mixture of saturated and unsaturated fats. Monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. It has all the things. In the same way, any population is going to have a big range of political views. An immigrant group is going to have a range of political views. But the averages matter. If you slowly introduce enough unsaturated fat into butter, it will be, eventually, liquid butter. You don't need to take all the saturated fat out. You just need to adjust the average until eventually the whole starts to change. And what happens to the average of our society when we get mass immigration? Remember, everywhere else in the world, more or less, is less libertarian than us. Well, we become less libertarian when we get mass immigration. So if we bring in more authoritarian views into our society, we get more controlled speech. Mass immigration means less gun rights. Mass immigration means bigger government. If we put our emotions aside and we look at the average, we look at the trends, and we look at the statistics, we can see what's going on. Authoritarians support mass immigration because it helps empower them. Mass immigration is a tool to help them get what they want. Libertarians going down this pipeline start to see how immigration is a force against libertarianism in this country. Big government Democrats and big government Republicans, while they might have different lines that they speak, ultimately, both of them try and pull people into this country for their own gain. They're not trying to pull in people because it'll push us towards liberty. They're doing it for other reasons. To a large degree, these immigrants are brought in specifically to change our country. So our libertarian going down the pipeline becomes a closed border libertarian. Instead of envisioning an America that's free for everyone to come into and it's all full of liberty, well, they get over that and they start to develop a vision of America as a closed libertarian paradise that can be used as an example for the rest of the world to copy. So libertarianism can still spread, but it's by an example that can be copied. But then our libertarian in the pipeline gets exposed to more information. They start to understand the heritability of political views and the effects of genetics. Long-standing non-white groups in the United States still don't support free speech. Let's look back at that YouGov poll. Blacks support free speech even less than Hispanics. And many of them have been here in the United States for quite a bit longer, so it's just not that they haven't had enough time to absorb the culture. The heritability of political views is a real thing. Jordan Peterson talks about that.
Political belief is determined in large part by temperament and personality, and that's very strongly biologically influenced.
The war of political views is on some level a genetic phenomena. It's not that you're trying to just create a society of libertarian views. On some level, you need libertarian genetics. And if you don't like libertarianism, well, then your solution is simple. Continue to import as many allies who will help you push authoritarianism as possible. So now we have a racial worldview, a genetic worldview. Humans are animals, and biology is important. Ignoring biology when you're trying to work with living organisms, including humans, is kind of naive. So this libertarian, now with their new worldview, gets called alt-right. And you're going to get called alt-right if you have a racial genetic view of the world and you're white. That's just normal. It's mostly a scare term used by the left nowadays in the mainstream media. The left itself will also have racial views, but those are racial oppression narrative views. They'll have a lot of white guilt. That's not the same as a genetic, heritable racial worldview, right? Oppression narratives are not biology, right? And so our libertarians going through the alt-right pipeline, they start to learn that they weren't the first libertarian to go through this sort of radical change to their view. You know the modern libertarian movement and how it got started, right? If you don't know, Hoppe will tell you.
The history of modern libertarianism is still quite young. It began actually in Murray Rothbard's living room and found its first quasi-canonical expression in his book For a New Liberty, a Libertarian Manifesto. This was published in 1973. And the libertarian movement included initially no more than about 10 people fitting in Murray Rothbard's living room.
That's right. It got started, to a large degree, with Murray Rothbard. Later in Rothbard's life, he wrote Nations by Consent. Quote, open borders, or the Camp of the Saints problem. The question of open borders or free immigration has become an accelerating problem for classical liberals This is first because the welfare state increasingly subsidizes immigrants to enter and receive permanent assistance, and second because cultural boundaries have become increasingly swamped. I began to rethink my views on immigration when, as the Soviet Union collapsed, it became clear that ethnic Russians had been encouraged to flood into Estonia and Latvia in order to destroy the cultures and languages of these peoples. Previously, it had been easy to dismiss as unrealistic Jean Rapal's anti-immigrant novel The Camp of the Saints, in which virtually the entire population of India decides to move in small boats into France, and the French, infected with liberal ideology, cannot summon the will to prevent economic and cultural national destruction. As culture and the welfare state problems have intensified, it became impossible to dismiss Raspal's concerns any longer. However, on rethinking immigration on the basis of the anarcho-capitalist model, it became clear to me a totally privatized country would not be open borders at all. Every piece of land in a country were owned by some person, group, or corporation. This would mean that no immigrant could enter there unless invited to enter and allowed to rent or purchase property. A totally privatized country would be closed as the particular inhabitants and property owners desire. It seems clear then that the regime of open borders that exists de facto in the United States really amounts to a compulsory opening by the central state, the state in charge of all streets and public land areas, and does not genuinely reflect the wishes of the proprietors. So there you have it. In some ways, the original libertarian, Murray Rothbard, went down the alt-right pipeline. His world, as he saw more of the world, as he saw some of these issues come to fruition through the end of the Soviet Union, he started to develop a more nuanced view of culture and nation and borders. So after a libertarian goes through the pipeline, what happens to all their old libertarian views about sound money, ending the Fed, and their understanding of the broken window fallacy? Well, the pipeline isn't really something that needs to take you out of libertarianism into the alt-right. For many libertarians, it's just the addition of more nuanced understanding onto the same libertarian views. Many of these alt-right libertarians are just still libertarians. But now they have some understanding that you can't bring people into your country who are against libertarianism but expect to maintain liberty. If you want a society where race doesn't matter, but in polling, the majority of every race other than whites views their race as important, well, if you start bringing them in, race is going to start to matter. If you want meritocracy, best man for the job, best woman for the job, no matter who, and we have data showing that every racial group is significantly more in-group preferenced than whites, well, if you start bringing these people into your country, kiss meritocracy goodbye. Say hello to racial nepotism. Say hello to racial favoritism and corruption. And say hello to race riots. Just like adding enough saturated fat to olive oil, it doesn't need to be all saturated. It just needs to be saturated enough. And then you'll have solid olive oil. Of course, people in the media will say all sorts of things about the alt-right. They'll say, oh, well, they'll call you alt-right if you have any sort of racial view that has to do with genetics. But then they'll say, oh, well, you must believe all the same things as Hitler or whatever. They'll use it as a vague insult term, not a meaningful position. But that's why they're not able to understand the alt-right pipeline. After all, some of these people hurled the same insults at Rothbard.
Rothbard, the spiritus rector of modern libertarianism, has been branded, for instance, by this so-called anti-fascist crowd as a reactionary, a racist, a sexist, an authoritarian, an elitist, a xenophobe, a fascist, and, to top it all off, as a self-hating Jewish Nazi.
So there you go. Most of the libertarian to alt-right pipeline guys are still, deep down, libertarians. They can be as much libertarian as Rothbard was, and he's the real deal. But now they have more nuanced views on human biodiversity and how group averages, rather than anecdotes, shape our societies. Many of them would agree with me and my video, race is pre-political.